Cody Labarth. I'm one of the pastors at Missio Church, one of the partner churches of Radiant Church here, and the introduction I got earlier was certainly kinder than I deserve, but what a joy it is to be with you this morning and really to see all the things that God has been doing in and through this church in the few years that Radiant Church has existed. And so just so thankful for this church, what you're doing in this community, and your partnership in the gospel. And so what a joy to be here this morning. While Jason's away visiting a partner church, he asked me to step in and preach, and in considering what I would talk about this morning, we have been at Missio in the Gospel of Matthew, and so recently looked at a story that probably to some in this room, or even many in this room, is familiar, the story of Jesus walking on the water. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning. Before we get there, just want to ask a quick question. Have you ever just needed to get away and find some quiet space? Just get away from the noise, kind of the busyness of life, and just go in and be alone a bit. Now, if you're an introvert in the room, you're like, of course. If you're a parent of young children in the room, you're like, absolutely, almost every day. But the reality is we all reach that point at times. We all reach a point where we just need to get away and have some space to ourselves. When I think about that topic, story comes to mind. Shortly after my college years, which now for me is a while ago, shortly after my college years, I led a short-term mission team to China. So spent like 8 weeks in China for the summer doing lots of evangelism amongst college students, and it was a great summer. Spent the whole summer, though, in a small apartment with 6 other guys, and we just lived like right on top of one another, like bunked up in rooms, and just all summer long, 8 weeks long, we were just around each other the whole time, or we were out with students kind of all day long into the evening, meeting with people, talking about Jesus. And so the point is just around people all the time. And so by the time the summer came to an end, I actually was staying a bit longer than the rest of the team. So the other guys, they went and got on the airplane, and I just remember being in that apartment by myself, and just like the quietness that was in that space just felt so amazing. And I'm a pretty extroverted person, but even me, I was just like, this is great. I'm just going to stay in this apartment for like the next 3 days, and I'm not going anywhere or doing anything, or certainly not talking to anybody. And so like 30 minutes goes by, and I think I was just like laying on the sofa, just soaking it all in. But I hear a knock at the door. And it's like, I'm in China. It's like not too many people even know where we live. It's like, who's knocking at the door? So I walk over and I look through the people, and it's one of the students that we had just spent the summer with, and his English name was Tom. So I'm kind of like, what's going on? I open the door. Hey, Tom, what are you doing? Why are you here? And he says, hey, I knew the rest of the team were leaving today, and I thought that you might be lonely, so I just came to spend some time with you. And I just like died on the inside. It was just like, what? Why are you here? So of course I don't tell him that. I invite him in, and like I think we like have a meal. But eventually I just have to tell him, I'm like, Tom, I love you, man, but I just really need some alone time. And he understood and was gracious and kind of let me have it. All that to say, that actually kind of helps us think about what's going on in the text that we'll look at today. In Matthew 14, picking up in verse 22, we see Jesus, where this isn't the first time he's done it, he actually attempts to withdraw, to get away from the crowds, to get away even from his disciples and spend some time alone. Now, as we'll see in a moment, his purpose in that is not quite as selfish as the ends that I had in mind. Like, I just needed personal time. He wants to get alone so that he can be with his Father. And then, in the events that follow in this passage, as he goes on, as I said a moment ago, as he goes on and walks on water, coming to his disciples, he teaches them, and I would say he teaches us, a lesson about who he is, and a lesson about what it looks like to follow him as his disciples. And so as we look at this passage, those are really the two big things that we're looking at. It's a passage that's about Jesus and discipleship. And so let's go ahead and dig in. Again, we're going to pick up in chapter 14, verse 22. But before we do that, I'll just take a moment and pray for us one more time. Lord, just thank you for this morning. Thank you that we can be in this room together, that we can sing of the glories of your gospel and your name. And as we set our mind on your word, pray that by your Spirit you would help us, give us eyes to see, ears to hear the truth of your word. You tell us that your word is living and active, sharper than a two-edged sword, Lord, that it divides, bone and flesh, even soul and spirit, that it discerns the thoughts and the intentions of our heart, and that it always accomplishes its purpose. And so may your word do that this morning. May you shape us, those of us who are your people, more and more into your image. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'll read the passage for us, and then we'll jump in and look at a few things. Again, picking up in verse 22, this is the word of the Lord. The word says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. And when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And so where we're picking up in Matthew's gospel, we read that, he immediately, what came right before this is that it's the story of him feeding 5,000 people. Well, that's just the men, not including the women and children. He feeds this crowd with only a bit of bread and fish, and does this great miracle. And then after that, even right before that, he had attempted to withdraw and get away. The crowds came to him. So then he does the miracle, and then after that, it says immediately he made the disciples get into a boat, go before him to the other side, and he goes up on the mountain to pray. Now, this actually isn't really the main point, or one of the two main points that I mentioned earlier, though it's related. I just want to pause here for a moment, though, and because I think that we see in Jesus doing this, we learn something about the life of faith here. Now, Jesus, we see that an integral part of his life and living in relationship with his Father was to occasionally make time just to go and be with him, to meet with him. You could call this the discipline of solitude. He's withdrawing to be alone with the Father. Now, at Missio Church, we often talk about, and I know that those at Radiant agree with this, that our first priority, the first outcome, we say, of being a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jesus, is living in pursuit of relationship with the Father. You could say intimacy with the Father. It's living for the relationship that we were created for, to know him and to walk with him and to worship him. And we don't just naturally do that on our own. What we see Jesus doing is clearing time in his busy life to go and do this. Now, our culture is not very good at this. We live in a culture where we are inundated with distraction all the time. We all, right now, probably everyone has a phone in our pocket that when we, after the service, look at it, we're probably going to have like 10 notifications. We're going to have missed emails or messages that are going to come through. We're going to be behind on the Twitter or the X feed or whatever it's called these days. Like there's a constant flow of information, and that's just digital life. That's not our job. That's not if you have a young family and young kids. And, our life is filled with all sorts of things that aren't bad things, but might distract us from the relationship that we were created for, the relationship that should be first and highest priority. And so what we see Jesus doing here is making it a priority, because he knew it was vital to his soul. It was vital to his life that he go and make time to meet with his Father. And so quite simply, I just don't want us to miss that point, though it's not the main point of this text, to miss what Jesus is doing here and miss the example that he sets for us. Because if Jesus needed to do it, how much more do we need to do the same thing? famous, well-known pastor of old, Jonathan Edwards, he says this about this idea. He says, a true Christian doubtless delights in religious fellowship and Christian conversation and finds much to affect his heart in it. But he also delights at times to retire from all mankind, to converse with God in solitary places. And this also has its peculiar advantages for fixing his heart and engaging its affections. And so we see that spending time in relationship with the Father is vital. And so we read that Jesus goes and does that, and he spends the night in prayer. And as he does so, the disciples that he had put into a boat and sent across the Sea of Galilee, it says that the boat has gone a long way from land, and now it's being beaten by the waves. The wind was against them. Now, I didn't grow up doing this, but I married into a family that was like a boating family. So my wife, Vicky, who's her birthday today, by the way, if you see her after the service, she grew up in Scotland, and her father grew up sailing on the coast of Scotland. And so anyway, we're married into a sailing family. And so I've been on a boat out in the open water a number of times now, and it's great and it's fun until the weather changes. And then it's really scary. Like, you just realize how powerless you are. You realize how strong the elements are. And so I can just imagine, and if you've ever been on a boat like this and been on a boat in bad weather, you know that you're in danger. You don't just feel in danger, like you actually are in danger. And the disciples are out on the Sea of Galilee. Like, this is a big body of water. This isn't Onondaga Lake. It's a big body of water. So the question is, like, it kind of seems like, why would Jesus do this? Why would he send them off into the sea so that they're going to be beaten by the waves, so that their life is actually going to be at risk? Now, what we see in the passage is that it seems that Jesus did this for a purpose. He did this to teach them something. And so he's up there on the mountain, he's on the mountain. He's looking out, he can see the sea, he knows what the conditions are like. He might even be able to see the disciples being driven by the wind. Yet he doesn't even go to them immediately. He spends the night in prayer. We're told then he goes to them in the fourth watch of the night. So that's kind of like, that's Roman timekeeping. So that would have been like between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Most of you in this room probably felt like you woke up in the fourth watch of the night this morning with daylight savings time, if you feel like I do. So he lets them get driven by the wind all night long, and then he goes to them. And the scripture says he comes to them walking on the sea. Now, yes, that seems to them just as wild as it sounds to us whenever we hear that today. That Jesus came to them walking on the sea. Now, some have tried to give like naturalistic explanations for this. Like Jesus didn't really walk on the water. He probably walked on a sandbar out to the disciples. But that doesn't really make sense for a group of disciples who we know, some of them are fishermen who they know what the sea is like. They know there's not a sandbar there. It doesn't make sense of their reaction. Some have just said there's no way it actually happened, like it's impossible, so it's just a made-up story. But the text says, and means exactly this: Jesus came to them walking on the sea. And the reaction of the disciples is exactly what you would expect. The middle of the night, they've been driven by the wind all night, their lives are in danger, and then they see Jesus, and they are terrified. Their first reaction is, in that state of mind, is to think, this is a ghost. Like, there's a ghost walking on the water. Now, this just shows us how supernatural this is. They jump immediately to that kind of explanation, and they cry out in fear. And then Jesus comes to them, he says to them this: "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And friends, there is a lot in that statement. I said that one of the main things we would see in this passage is who Jesus is. Now, that statement, on its face, it seems kind of simple. Take heart, it is I. Now, you can translate that, it is I, but in the Greek, it quite literally reads, the I am. Take heart, I am here. Now many of you might know, the disciples certainly would have known, that this name, to say I am, it's actually the name of God. This is the name that God reveals to himself, reveals of himself to Moses. We read about that in Exodus chapter 3. Moses, he sees the burning bush. God speaks to him. He tells him he's going to send him to his people, to the Israelites. Moses says, well, if I come to the people of Israel and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, well, what is his name? Like, who is this God? What shall I say? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Friends, this is the name of God understood by his people, by the Israelites throughout their history, a name that was so revered that they wouldn't even speak it out loud. They wouldn't write out the full name. We don't really know how it was spelled, or like Yahweh is what we say. That's just the English transliteration. We don't fully know how the name would be pronounced because the name was so revered, they wouldn't fully record it or even say it. But Jesus comes up here saying to them quite literally, do not be afraid. I am is here. God is here. Now, we begin to see some of the purpose that Jesus has in putting his disciples into that boat. Not only did he want to be alone with the Father, but he wants to show his disciples, as he's been showing them time and time again, as if you go through the Gospels and if you're in the book of Matthew, just time and time again, it's being revealed in different ways who this man is. That Jesus, he's not just a man, he's God himself. And Jesus, he wasn't averse to using boats. We see him in boats at other times in the gospel. He could have walked around to the other side of the sea and met his disciples on the other side of that lake. But that day, he decided to show up to them walking on the water so that his disciples could understand. And when they're a bit more sober-minded and they're not so terrified thinking it's a ghost, that they would understand that there's only one who walks on the sea. And that's God himself. Friends, this is declared a number of times throughout the scriptures. Just a few examples. In the book of Job, if you're familiar with that story, Job, he's suffering these terrible things, and his supposed friends come to him, and they're like interrogating him about his life and what he's done to deserve all of these horrible things that have happened to him, what hidden sin he has that God must be judging him for. And Job, he responds at one point to his friends, declaring the holiness of God, asking the question, who can be truly in the right before God? In Job chapter 9, he says, the God who commands the sun, and it does not rise. The God who seals up the stars, who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled upon the waves of the sea. Later on in the same book, God is going to ask of Job, when he's kind of questioning him, he's going to ask Job, have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? The idea being God had. In Psalm 77, the psalmist, he's remembering whenever God saves Israel out of the hand of Pharaoh in Egypt. And he says of God, your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. Friends, time and time again in the scriptures, we have these, they're kind of poetic. They're figurative descriptions of God's power, his absolute power over his creation. Yet here in Matthew 14, this is very literal and very, very real. Here comes Jesus walking on the water and saying, I am is here. God is here. Jesus is teaching his disciples who he is. He wanted to teach them that even amid this crazy storm, he is there. God is here. He's revealing who he is. So that's one big lesson in this story. Who is Jesus? Well, he's God. And the second big lesson is related to it. It's a lesson on discipleship. What then does it look like? What does it mean to follow this man who is God? And that's what we see in the next part of the story, and this what happens with Peter. Just a few things we want to pull out of that. Now Peter, he seems unsure as Jesus shows up saying, "Do not be afraid. I is here." Now he's unsure. He says, "Lord, if it's you, well then command me to come out to you on the water." If you're familiar with the Gospels, like that doesn't really surprise you a lot about Peter. Like he would be the one to speak up first and be like, "I have an idea." "Well, show me your God. Let me come and walk to you." And Jesus graciously says, "Come." And what we see happen then, I think, is a lesson. It's a lesson about following Jesus. It's a lesson about, you could say, faith and discipleship. And the lesson is this, that Peter, he has the boldness to ask that he might walk on the water with Jesus. Like, he has the faith to recognize, like, okay, like, if you're God, then let me walk to you. But what we see is that even as he starts to walk toward Jesus and he begins to falter in that faith, what we see is that he must persevere in that faith as well. And I think that's the big takeaway for us. So I want to help you see it. So he gets out of the boat. His trust and his ability in Jesus, then his trust in Jesus' ability to keep him safe, to persevere throughout the midst of this crazy storm and these waves, it begins to waver. He sees the wind, he grows afraid, and this trust in Jesus begins to sink. Doubt sets in. And this walking on the water, then it becomes like a picture, like a reflection of his faith. For a moment he has faith, but then it begins to wane. So as he does it, he cries out, Lord, save me. And Jesus does. And Jesus then gives him this, some commentators, they see in this like Jesus is like being really stern with Peter here. But I think he's just giving Peter this kind of gentle rebuke. He says, "You have little faith. Why? Why did you doubt? Why did you doubt?" Now that's like the thing that he told his disciples not to do whenever he showed up. He said, "Don't be afraid. I'm here." And then Peter gets out of the boat and he trusts for a moment, but then he begins to waver. He begins to doubt. So Peter has the faith, the boldness to get out of the boat, which is commendable. It's an example for us. But then he's also a bit of a negative example because he looks around at his circumstances. He begins to doubt that Jesus has the power to keep him. It's not that he had no faith. He had faith. It's that he had too little faith. That was Jesus' correction. Why did you doubt? If only he had continued to trust in Jesus, well, then he never would have sunk in the first place. And so again, we get in this a picture of discipleship. We're called to put our faith in Jesus, absolutely. To trust in him as who he says he is. He's God. He's the one who saves. Yet we also see, and the scriptures testify to this time and time again, that true faith presses on. True faith perseveres. True faith continues in all circumstances. Now, it's no secret. I don't really have to tell you, like the Christian life, it's filled with trial and tribulation. None of that should surprise us. Jesus said it would happen. He tells us it will happen for his disciples. There will be trial and tribulation. But again, what we're seeing here is that Jesus is teaching us that true faith, it continues, it presses on even during trial and tribulation. It trusts in the Father's plans, in his care, his provision, his promises to his people. Even when our circumstances tell us maybe we shouldn't. The world would say that's silly. You shouldn't trust in a God that's going to save you out of this. What we see, though, time and time again in the scriptures is that our circumstances, they are never outside of the control of the God that we know and that we walk with. A God who rules over everything, who's the creator of heaven and earth, a God who walks on the seas. Just think about these examples in Scripture. It's whenever the armies surround God's people that he saves them out of the water. Like that's what happened with Pharaoh and the armies of Egypt. It's whenever the giant Goliath stands over the armies of Israel and towers over this young boy David, that God works this great deliverance. It's when his people are thrown into a furnace that he saves them out of the fiery furnace. It's whenever Daniel's put into a pit with lions that he closes the mouths of the lions and he delivers Daniel. It's when the Son, Jesus, hung on a cross, and it seems that Satan and death and sin, like they've won the day. But that's when God works his greatest act of deliverance. We serve and we walk with a God who is mighty to save. And that's what we're reminded of here in Matthew 14. And so wherever each of us are at, like I don't know where you're at. I don't know what trials and circumstances you are facing now or you might face tomorrow. And none of us know fully. Maybe you're here and you have a difficult marriage. And I think this passage is telling you, don't lose heart. Keep walking with Jesus. Keep trusting in his promises. Maybe you've received a really scary health diagnosis. Again, I think this passage is telling you, keep heart. Don't be afraid. Keep walking with Jesus. Maybe you're in a spot where, I don't know, you've lost a job. You don't know how you're going to provide for your family or what tomorrow's going to bring. The lesson's the same. Keep trusting. Keep walking with Jesus. Persevere. Friends, we could think of 1,000 different examples. And again, I don't know what situations you face now or might face, but what we see on display is that true faith. It's displayed in circumstances like these, whenever the storm rages. True faith, it shows itself that in every situation it trusts and continues to walk, continues to abide in Jesus, who is God. And actually that it's through these circumstances, it's through the trial, it's through the tribulation, that Jesus is committed and even said he will use to shape and to form his people, to strengthen our faith, to show us more and more what it looks like to be his disciples, so that we'll grow into a people. I think of what David said in Psalm 23, whenever he says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Not because he had any strength in and of himself. He says, because you are with me. And that's the kind of faith that Jesus is growing in Peter. That's the kind of faith that Jesus is committed to growing into everyone who is his disciple. It's what he wants to grow in you if you've come to trust and believe in him. And yet we see, even in the midst of Peter's doubt, Jesus, he doesn't leave him. He's so gracious to him. When Peter cries out, he grabs him by the hand because he is the God who saves out of the midst of the waters. He pulls out of the sea as he always has. And then we read, I'm starting to wrap up, I promise. And then we read that they got into the boat and the wind ceased. Because if there's any doubt left, like about who Jesus is, Jesus shows that not only is he the one who walks on the sea, but he's the one who calms it. Again, that's what's said of God in the Psalms. In Psalm 89, it says, Lord God of hosts, who is as mighty as you are, O Lord? With your faithfulness all around you, you rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Friends, I think one of the last lessons we learn about the life of discipleship here is that we see the response of the disciples to all of this. It says that when this happened, those in the boat, they worshiped him. And they said, truly, you are the Son of God. Friends, that really is the main point of it all. Jesus, he allows all this to happen. He does all of this so that his disciples might see and know and believe that he is the Son of God. That's to say, he shares in the same essence as his Father. They're one and the same. Now, to this point in Matthew's gospel, that's been declared a few times. God has said it. The Father has said it about Jesus. This is my Son. The demons have actually said it. They've said they recognize that this is the Son of God. But it's not yet been declared. It's not been said by any of Jesus' disciples. But here in Matthew 14, after Jesus comes to them saying, I am is here, it's the first time that they begin to see and trust and believe and declare, truly this is the Son of God. And really that's my great hope for all of you today, for all of us, is that we would declare that along with them. That everyone here at Radiant Church would see who Jesus is. Would continue to worship him. With our mouths, absolutely, but with all of our lives. And I pray that this passage would be a reminder of who Jesus is, and also of what we're called to as his people. To know and to trust that he's always with us. To trust in every trial and circumstance and storm that he has promised to be with us to the end of the age, he says. And to trust and know that whatever's going on in our lives, he is using it to shape and to form us into his people, a people of faith. And so, pray that we all would see and know and believe and declare, truly, this is the Son of God. And pray with me to that end.